Hi everyone, welcome back to Featherstitch House. My name's Rebecca and each week on this channel I make videos about embroidery and textile art to help you get creative. It's the last week in November and so we're going to work today to finish our November Winging It panel. This is the one where we have thread painted a hedgehog or a hibernating creature and have gradually been making a bed of leaves for him to hibernate in. This week we're going to add the finishing touches to our panel. We're going to make some more leaves using a very different technique, and we're going to draw our inspiration from a festival that we start November with in the UK. Now I think this festival is unique to Britain and it is a very strange festival. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it as we go through today's video, but it does involve fire. Now you're going to need either a heat tool or a candle to help you with today's project. I would also recommend having some water or a fire blanket handy just in case, opening a window, and if you've got some tweezers or tongs to protect your fingers, they're going to come in really useful as well. So don't be alarmed, it's going to be fun. Gather your bits and pieces and let's get stitching.
Okay, this is where we got up to last week. So we stitched our hedgehog over the first 2 weeks of November, and last week we did a photo print onto fabric using our inkjet printer technique, and we cut those leaves out, we fussy cut them out and then stitched them on just along the veins to start creating a leafy bed. And we'd also put in our watercolour background, just creating a wash of colour, and I used some of this mica powder paint to create a bit of shimmer as well. So we're going to complete our leafy bed today, and I thought we could use a technique that we haven't used at all this year. We used it a little bit back in 2022 when we made our Winging It book, and it does have relevance to the month of November. Now, if you live outside the UK, you probably don't know very much about this very strange festival that we have in this country, so I thought we could have a little bit of a history lesson as well as we go. We are going to use fire. Now I'm keeping it quite limited. This is a candle, it's going to mess with my contrast, so I'll just tuck it off into the corner until I absolutely need it. So this week we cleared our garden. We have had a little bit of snow, and I mean a little bit, it was a dusting, and it's been extremely cold here. And fortunately we had just done a clear of the leaves in our garden and used our little safe garden incinerator to burn them all, and it put me in mind of fire. And November, if you live in the UK, has a lot of reference to fire because we celebrate something called Bonfire Night on the 5th of November. And this is a very ancient festival. It's probably the weirdest festival we celebrate, and when I tell you a bit about it, if you don't already know, you'll understand what I mean by that. So what we're going to do is do some melting of fabrics, and I've got my candle ready and I've got some of this gold lame. Now this burns really well, and you do need to make sure you have precautions nearby, so I do have some water just off camera, and I'm using a candle because it's more sort of contained as a flame rather than just matches, and I've got some tweezers that I'm going to use, and I have taken precautions. I've cleared my workspace. Now gold lame melts really well, and I did some tests of different fabrics, and this is my burnt gold lame. Let me bring it up close. You can see, actually if I use the tweezers you'll be able to see a bit better maybe. You can see that it sort of crinkles and crumples up and gets this lovely texture to it, and I thought we could make use of that this week. It creates that sort of shriveled leaf effect, and I thought we could make some more leaves for our panel using some melting. Now I also have got some of this felt, and this is the felt that we use in most of our kits. We are moving to a wool blend felt because some of these lovely earthy colours that we used so much have stopped being made, and so for our autumn leaf kit we've had to bring in a wool blend felt to get the colours right. But this is a felt, it's called Kunin Eco-Fi felt, and it is beautiful to work with. It cuts and feels and behaves a lot like a wool blend felt. You get really crisp cuts, you can see there, cut out a circle. It's not like acrylic felt at all, and it holds its shape really well. It's really robust, it's machine washable, and I absolutely love using this felt. It has an advantage over wool felt in that it can be treated with heat, and interesting things happen to it when you burn it. So this is this brown one, and it melts and forms these little holes and gets lovely singeing on it, and you can shape it and manipulate it and alter the colour. So that's that one, and then I did a tiny little bit of this mustard yellow, and that got a lovely sort of golden toastiness to it that I thought was really nice. They all curl up as well, which is lovely. This is this gold one here, so that goes orangey, and you get these lovely ripples to it. And then I tried this burnt orange, got the dark red, went a really sort of dark burgundy colour, and curled really nicely as well. And so I thought we could make some leaf shapes out of these synthetic fabrics and use some flame to manipulate them and create some more crunchy, crispy leaves for our hedgehog to go to sleep in. And while we're doing it, I thought I would tell you about the Gunpowder Plot. So I found a template online. I will put a link to this in the description below. So this is from a blog called One Little Project, and it's a leaf template. It's free to download. I'll put a link in the description so that you can find it if you want to use it. They are going to get a lot smaller than this, so if you are looking for free templates online, you want fairly sizable ones so that you have got enough scope for some shrinkage. So I'm going to start by cutting these out, and I'll come back when I've done that because you don't need to watch me cutting out bits of paper. Okay, so I cut my leaves out and I've used a heat erase pen to just draw around them onto my felt. I've done 3 in lame. This frays really badly, and so I've just kept the simplest shape for the lame, and you can see how well this felt cuts. It is, like I say, not at all like craft felt. You can get really precise shapes. This one's probably the best example. You can make really precise cuts and get lovely shapes. So I'm going to bring in my candle. Hopefully it won't affect the contrast too much, and I'm just going to hold it over my candle. So not getting it that close to the flame, just allowing the heat to cause the fabric to start distorting and melting, and you can see that it's shrinking quite a lot. I'll do a comparison in a moment so that you can see the difference, but just get that lovely crinkly effect. So I know that the trend really at the moment in sewing and slow stitch is to go totally natural fibres, so using wool and linen and cotton and all of that, but there are some things that you just cannot do with natural fibres, and this is one of them, because they don't melt, they will just burn like wicks. And there are advantages sometimes to using synthetic fibres because you can do some really lovely creative things with them because of their synthetic properties, the fact that they melt rather than burn. And you cannot do this with cotton. Look at that. Oh my goodness. So you can see, if I just put it next to the original leaf, you can see that that has shrunk maybe to half the size, and that brings it into proportion with the other leaves on our panel. So I'm just going to melt these, just want to catch that little bit. And so let me tell you about the Gunpowder Plot. It was discovered on November the 4th, 1605, and so we celebrate Bonfire Night in the UK on November the 5th. The Gunpowder Plot was a conspiracy to blow up the Houses of Parliament with the King in it, and the plan was that this would take place on the 5th of November, which was going to be the state opening of Parliament. So all of the members of Parliament and the Lords and the King would be present, and it was a plot by Catholics. Now, I need to go back a little bit further in time to give some context for this. So Henry VIII, obviously you will have heard of. He was the king who had 6 wives, and he divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she couldn't provide him with a male heir, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. And in order to do that, she appealed to the Pope for a divorce, and the Pope refused. And so he broke away from the Catholic Church and set up the Church of England, and this enabled him to be the leader of the church, the head of the church, and so he then granted himself permission to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn therefore had to be a Protestant, and she was famously beheaded. She had, however, given birth to a daughter called Elizabeth, who became Elizabeth I. And in spite of 4 further marriages, Henry did actually have a male heir, but the male heir, Edward, died in his childhood, and so eventually Elizabeth I became the Queen of England. Now, she reigned for a good long time, about 60 years I think, but she famously died without leaving an heir, and so after her death the crown passed to the Stuarts, and James VI of Scotland became James I of England. Now, he was a Catholic. His mother was Mary Queen of Scots. During the time of Queen Elizabeth I, there was a plot to restore her to the throne of England and put a Catholic back on the throne. It was overthrown and she was executed, but her son, James Stuart, was the closest living surviving relative of Elizabeth I, and so when she died he became the King of England. Now, he was a Catholic, and everybody, the Catholics who had been persecuted for decades, they had no religious freedom, and they believed that his ascendancy to the throne would mean that they would be given some religious freedom, be allowed to practice their faith in the way that they chose, and that he would be sympathetic towards them. However, he was heading up a government that was Protestant. All of Parliament, most of Parliament were Protestant, and he really didn't feel secure on the throne, and so it was important for him to appease the Protestants. And so, in spite of being a Catholic and having sympathies with Catholics, he did very little to help them, and that led to them feeling utterly betrayed and angry. And so several of them, on several occasions actually, the Gunpowder Plot wasn't the only one, had conspired to overthrow the king and government and put a Catholic back on the throne. Now, the Gunpowder Plot was headed up by a man called Robert Catesby, and he led a group including Guido Fawkes and another man called Thomas Winter. There was a man called Thomas Percy, another man called Robert Keyes, and a man called John Wright, and there were others, but these were the main players. And they conspired together and came up with a plan to get rid of the entire British government in one fell swoop. And I use that phrase very deliberately. I'll explain why later. So they, over a period of weeks, smuggled barrels of gunpowder into an undercroft in the Houses of Parliament, so in like a cellar room underneath the Houses of Parliament. They disguised the barrels as barrels of potatoes, and they managed to smuggle in 36 barrels of gunpowder, which would have been enough to reduce the House of Parliament to rubble. So they plotted together for months, and Guido was the guy who was assigned the job of lighting the fuse, and so he was sent into the undercroft a couple of days before the Gunpowder Plot to sit as guard over the gunpowder, and he was going to be the one to light the fuse and then escape at the last minute. And this was all set to happen on November the 5th, when Parliament was going to have its state opening and the King would be there. Now, one of the members of Parliament, a man called William Parker, was a Catholic, and he was due to be in attendance on November the 5th. And one of the conspirators, we don't really know who for sure, but they were concerned about his welfare, and so anonymously sent him a letter warning him not to attend the state opening of Parliament because a terrible fate would befall him if he did. And whoever wrote that letter assumed that he would keep their secret and be on their side. However, he immediately suspected that there was another plot. This was maybe the fourth major plot to destroy and overthrow government and get rid of James Stewart. And so he took the letter to the authorities, and they searched the House of Parliament on the 4th of November, the night before the state opening, and lo and behold discovered Guido Fawkes in the undercroft with a lighted lantern and a burning taper ready to light the fuse. Now, he was immediately arrested. The undercroft was cleared of gunpowder, and he was taken to the Tower of London, where he was tortured mercilessly until he gave up the names of his co-conspirators. He was sentenced to be executed as a traitor. This was considered to be high treason, and so he was sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered, which was a particularly vicious and brutal execution, saved exclusively for traitors. And he did give up the names of his co-conspirators, and they were rounded up in the space of a week. So they fled initially, but were hunted down and were rounded up and were all executed by the 12th of November. Now, for several years to come after the thwarting of the Gunpowder Plot, the defeat of the plotters was celebrated across Britain, and it became tradition to ring bells and have special sermons about loyalty to the crown. And gradually a tradition developed where fires were lit and effigies of Guido Fawkes, who really took the blame as the main conspirator for decades, even though he wasn't the main guy. Effigies of him were burnt on bonfires around the country as a way to remember what happens to traitors, and that gradually has turned into what we now celebrate as Bonfire Night. Now, hopefully, now that I've told you about that, it's clear to you that that is a really odd thing to celebrate. We are essentially celebrating the execution of 5 political activists who were trying to, maybe in a flawed way, but they were trying to win some freedom for themselves and their fellow Catholics. Possibly misguided, but it seems strange that centuries on we still have an approximation of Bonfire Night today. Now, when I was a kid, we used to make Guy Fawkes's, and children would wheel them around the neighbourhood in a wheelbarrow. So you'd get your dad's trousers, stuff them with straw and an old jumper, and you'd often use like an old sack or something like that, or a pair of your mum's tights to make a head and fill it with newspaper or whatever, and put a hat on it, and you'd wheel it around the neighbourhood shouting penny for the guy, and you'd a little bit like trick or treating, I suppose, because we didn't really have Halloween when I was a child. We didn't really do it in the way that we do it now. It was Bonfire Night was the thing that we did. So we'd go door to door with our Guy Fawkes, and we would say penny for the guy, and people would give you a penny or 10p. It probably was 10 pence when I was a child for your Guy Fawkes, and lots of schools had Guy Fawkes competitions where you'd have to make a Guy Fawkes, and the best one would be the one that went on top of the bonfire. Lots of people would have bonfires in their back gardens, and I remember having a friend who would always have a really big bonfire party in her garden, and my mum would always make toffee apples for that event and bonfire toffee, and we'd light sparklers and things like that, and then there would be fireworks at the end, and it was just a brilliant night. And we don't often have bonfires anymore, but we do have firework events, and me and Rick and Zoe went off to a fireworks event on the 5th of November locally, and I made some toffee apples, kind of in memory of my mum who passed away earlier this year, and we had a lovely old time at Bonfire Night. So that is a weird festival, and what you might not know is that that phrase that I drew your attention to, one fell swoop, comes from a very famous play by William Shakespeare called McBeth, and I'm quite certain you've all heard of it. So McBeth is about a plot against the king. It's about a treacherous man who usurps the throne for himself, but ultimately it's a play about treason and what happens to those who defy God's appointed monarch and try and overthrow the crown. And so it's not spoiling anything, it's a tragedy. McBeth absolutely gets his comeuppance at the end of the play, and Shakespeare very carefully chose to use one of the big events of the time, the Gunpowder Plot, that everybody knew about. It was probably the most famous news event at the time, and he wrote a play that reassured everybody that the King James, the very king who had been the plotters had tried to assassinate, he reassured everybody that this was God's king, that he had a divine right to the throne, and that everybody should be mindful of supporting him, because if they didn't, God would judge them for their treachery and they would meet a terrible end, just like McBeth does. That quote, "one fell swoop," comes from the play Macbeth, and it's from the scene when Macduff hears that Macbeth has surprised his castle and killed the whole of Macduff's family. He talks about them all being killed in one fell swoop. All my pretty chickens and their dam in one fell swoop. That's what he says. And so I use that phrase very deliberately because it's a quote from the play that was written directly after the Gunpowder Plot. So Macbeth was first performed in August 1606, which is less than a year after the plotters were all executed. So there you go, a little bit of history lesson and why in the UK we have fireworks in November and why we still celebrate something called Bonfire Night. Now, you've asked for more poetry, and I know I did that sad poem about the hedgehog last week, but there is a poem about the Gunpowder Plot. It's by John Milton, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, and he wrote it as a reminder of the Gunpowder Plot. And I remember as a child having to write out this poem and decorate it with scenes of a bonfire, that kind of thing. So I'm just going to read it. It's quite short. It goes like this. Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up the king and the parliament, 70 barrels of powder below, poor old England to overthrow. By God's providence he was catched with the dark lantern and burning match. Holla boys, let the bells ring. Holla boys, God save the king. So that was John Milton's sort of cautionary poem to remind everybody to support the king and not be tempted to commit treason. So there we go. I have got a couple more leaves to go, but I am loving the way these are crisping up. They're going lovely and crunchy, and they're going so lovely and curly as well. I've got some bits of wax on, but I can just melt those off if I'm worried about it. Just heat it up a little bit more and it'll either soak in or melt off. So I'm going to finish curling up my leaves and then we'll add them to our panel. So I'll be back when I've finished making my leaves. Right, I've got my crispy leaves, so now I'm going to add these on, and I want to make sure that I'm not totally covering everything that I've already done. So let's grab my applique pins as a starting point. These are going to carry on adding that texture that we've been looking for. I'm just going to put these around the edges. I may have done too many, but I think we can manage, and I want to make sure I can always fold up some of these, I can crumple them even more. So I want to make sure that I'm covering bits of the hedgehog as well, because we want to carry on making his little leafy bed. So I'm just going to crumple that a little bit in the middle there. You can always melt it a little bit more. You can steer the melt a little bit. And I should say that if you are nervous about doing it over a flame like I've done it, you can use a heat tool if you want to. So if you've got a heat tool, so either for embossing or for paint removal, it will work if you use that as well. So I've probably got too many leaves here because I don't want to totally cover up everything, but it's just adding loads more texture and interest onto our little hedgehoggy panel. I'm loving this. I've really enjoyed this panel. I think I don't often just do pure embroidery in these videos, so it's been nice to do a panel that has got so much just pure stitching. And if you haven't seen these, if you haven't seen the videos about how we made the hedgehog, do go back and look, because even though it might look complicated, I promise you it's fairly straightforward. It's just straight stitch when it comes down to it. We didn't do anything other than straight stitch on this one. Now, talking about burying hedgehogs in leaves, hedgehogs do this themselves. They burrow in and create a little leafy nest for themselves. So if you are burning leaves, particularly in the UK or in countries where hedgehogs live, you do need to double check your leaf pile. So when we were burning our leaves, we did it shovelful by shovelful, and we checked each load before we put it into the incinerator to make sure there was nothing living in it. It's really important that you do that, because if you, particularly if your leaf pile has been left for a couple of days, hedgehogs do like to make homes in piles of leaves and start hibernating there. So it's really important that you double check underneath your leaf pile to make sure there aren't any hibernating creatures there. Oh, look at that, I really like it. So I've just positioned my leaves. I have used most of them there, but obviously we'll be trimming off sections of this, so we don't need to worry too much. I've got my silky threads again from last week, and I'm going to do a fairly similar technique. So I'm going to start by just putting a running stitch down the middle. Now if you want to do some decorative stitch on these, by all means go for it. So a fly stitch would look really nice, or feather stitches, or you could do some really sort of ornate decorative stitching if you want to, but I think I just want to keep it simple because this one really is about the hedgehog at the centre, and I want him to be the stitched focus of this panel. So I'm just going to put in some running stitches, just like I did last week, up the centre of the leaves and out along each leaf lobe. And I need to make my stitches a bit bigger because they're getting buried a little bit in the leaf, but I can sort that out. So I'm just going to stitch them on, and like we did before, I can just use my thumb to manipulate the positioning of that leaf and just expose a little bit more of the hedgehog or a little bit more of the leaves we put on last week, and it will just add in extra texture as well. so that leaf will sort of ripple up a little bit and look a little bit more dimensional. So I'm quite liking our little nod to Bonfire Night with our burnt felt leaves and burnt synthetic fabric. I think that gives a nod to Bonfire Night in November without being too obvious, because I know lots of people around the world don't do anything for our weird celebration of the survival of the British government in 1605, so that probably isn't something you are busy celebrating in wherever in the world you're watching this video from. As always, this is just a starting point and you can adapt this in whatever way you want to make it relevant to what's happening in the world around you. And again, this might not be the most exciting thing to watch me do, so I'll stitch a bit and then I'll fast forward and come back to show you our next stage, because we're not going to leave it at this. We need to add a couple of extra details as well. I've got my aperture here so that you can get a bit of a sense of how it's looking so far. So once we've trimmed it back, we're going to have a lovely sort of autumnal panel here. I'm really enjoying the way that's looking. So another thing that has happened during November in the UK is we've had an unseasonably cold spell. So normally we have temperatures that are around, I don't know, 10 or 11 Celsius around this time of year, but we've had a freezing cold snap and it has brought some snow with it. And so I thought we could have a nod to that by adding some beads. So I've got some little seed beads here, I've got some creamy off-white ones, I've got some more snowy white ones, and then I've got these glassy crystal beads. I've also managed to find, where are they, some little silver snowflake beads that I think are quite nice as well. We might put a few of those on, and I've also got some sequins, but I thought it would be nice to just add a bit of a beaded element to this. So I've got some dark thread. You can do this with white or dark. You want something that's going to sort of hide away in the background. I'm not using my machine silk because they do break quite easily, so you want a fairly robust thread. I should also say that I've given this a bit of a press from the back just to sort of flatten down a little bit. Let's start with these little white seed beads. I'm just going to pop them in some clusters here. So I'm just picking up brought my thread through, picking up a bead on the edge of my needle and stitching back. And I think it would be nice to cluster some different beads together. Might be better if I tip some onto my mat here. Let's start with these and see how we get on. So I'm just going to pull in a few beads. So I'm just going to put in a few beads in this section. To create a sense of frost or snow in amongst the leaves. Got a little cluster there. I can then tie off my thread. You want to put a knot in every 5 or 6 beads really. So I'm just going to look for spaces where I can put in a little cluster of beads. So maybe over here I can add another one. You can put sequins in as well if you want to. Anything that's going to give that sort of frosty, snowy feel. And sometimes you might want to pick up a couple of beads at a time. And let them just form their own little shape there, like that. So I'm going to add some of these little clusters around, and that hopefully will give a sense of this being quite frosty and damp, and maybe even a little bit snowy. So it'll just be another way that we're catching the light as the panel moves. So put those on and then I'll come back and show you where we've got up to. So here is our finished November panel. We've got our photo printed leaves, we've got our burnt felt and synthetic fabric leaves, we've put in our little frosty beads, and we've got our silk painted or thread painted hedgehog at the centre ready to hibernate. I've just put some binding around the edge, just show you the back. So I've used my usual method, and if you're not sure how to do that, I will put a link to a video that shows you how to do that in the card at the top. And then I've just added in my little November month marker just to finish it off. So I hope that you have enjoyed the process of this one. In some ways it's been a really simple one. We just did our simple thread painting in the centre, and the stitching around the rest of the panel is really simple, just running stitch, and all of the interest from this one comes from the texture and the techniques that we've used in the leaves. So I can't wait to see your versions of our little hibernating creature. I've seen some lovely ones on Instagram and in our private Facebook group, and if you're not sure about that, I will put a link to that in the description below. If you are sharing your versions, don't forget to tag me at Featherstitch House, and you can use hashtag FSHwingingit24 on Instagram so that all our panels are pulled together and we can see what each other has created. So have great fun adding a little bit of heat to create a bit of bonfire or leaf burning into your panel, and I look forward to seeing your creations. Take care, have a great week, and I'll see you soon. Bye!